Hello friends, I'm Simon and this is my review of the Fox Lab Leaf 60, a 5.5 degree 60%, which was available in polycarbonate, as you see here, as well as aluminum, and there was an option for a small run of PVD finished brass. This thing came with a aluminum as well as a polycarbonate plate, and we've got the polycarbonate plate in here, and had a hot swap PCB, which is not in here. This is an aftermarket PCB. This is a gasket mount keyboard, though gasket is a very broad definition, and there are many types of gaskets, some more gaskety than others. In my opinion, this keyboard doesn't really qualify as a gasket mount. It's, technically a gasket mount, but in reality, it's more of a sandwich mount, as the gaskets that sandwich the plate in are incredibly rigid and thin. It comes in all the standard 60% layouts. So we've got wing keyless here. It comes in HHKB, as well as a standard 60. It has an interesting weight, a nice aluminum leaf shaped weight, with the option for PVD brass, and it was fairly inexpensive at 275 USD for the base kit, which included polycarbonate if you wanted it, which I think comes up to about 320 to 330 after fees and shipping, which isn't too bad in terms of a decent value proposition. So I'd like to thank Paul, who loaned me this keyboard for this review. There's a lot of things that are different with this. There's some foam put in here to aid with the acoustics. It's got a standard polycarbonate plate and an aftermarket PCB as well, a solderable PCB. Besides that, I believe the board is fully stock in its most default configuration. And let's pop in and take a look at the external case design. And here it is. Now, this particular unit is in matte frosted polycarbonate, which was the only polycarbonate version available, though the aluminum versions actually had quite a few color options, and in tandem with the color options on the weight, it actually allowed you to get quite a few very nice color combos, and I really appreciate that stylistic decision. In terms of the design of the keyboard, we can see that the edges here, the corners are all rounded, which is quite nice to see. On the polycarbonate though, we can see the screw tabs, which screw the case bottom into the case top. Some people may like that, some people may not. There's no way really around it, considering the translucent nature of polycarbonate as a whole, besides, putting a layer of finishing. There is a defined seam, and the seam on the aluminum models is actually very well matched in terms of anodization. Here it doesn't truly matter, but you can tell that there is a seam. In addition to the seam, there is this lovely curve here at the bottom. It kind of looks like a long elongated raindrop of sorts. I really like this curve. It plays well with the rest of the case design, and the rest of the case is fairly simple. It's just a wedge with a bottom that goes down at the 90-degree angle of the case angle instead of going straight down. We've got the bezels here, which I believe are 7mm by 6mm, and they play well together. As a whole, it makes the keyboard look pretty good. Now, this version here has the wing keyless blockers, and the style of the wing keyless blockers is the more stereotypical Korean style, where they come up a little bit higher and the edges are far more defined and less rounded. Now, the leaf gets its name from this particular weight. Now, this weight here is in aluminum, and is anodized to a nice yellow anodization to give a look of fake brass. Also, in the case of the polycarbonate keyboard, this does act as a weight. Now, a PVD brass version of this was available, though a lot of users had issues with the finishing, since PVD is harder to get consistent, especially if you've got ridges like these. And this is, you know, a nice texture right here. It's very well done. I'm a big fan. We can see from the outside that the weight is a wedge and follows the angle of the case bottom. Now, in terms of polycarbonate, I am personally not a fan of polycarbonate for a few reasons. One of the main reasons is the simple fact that the quality control during the manufacturing process is incredibly difficult, most notably when it comes to warping. Now, this keyboard has quite a noticeable warp to it. We can see that the center sits much higher than the edges, and that's fairly normal. As polycarbonate is CNC'd, it will heat up, and like all plastic, when it heats up, it will warp. And it's possible. I think there are some manufacturing methods to help the situation a little bit, but the majority of the work is obviously done during the quality control phase. And I personally think that this quality control is okay, considering the size of the board. The warp is not drastic enough to have this technically fail QC, though it is noticeable, and it is slightly annoying to see that this here is much lower than this here. In addition to this, another issue with polycarbonate is the frosting. Now, it may be hard to see on camera, but you can probably see that there are a few micro scratches all over the board. Now, there are, I believe, for this keyboard, there's a few layers of coating. One of them is the UV protective coating, and the UV protective coating is meant to keep the polycarbonate from yellowing over time. Though this coating will fade and will scratch, and all in all, eventually the polycarbonate will yellow. Polycarbonate is well known for yellowing when exposed to direct sunlight over an extended period of time. So you've got the yellowing issue, and then you've got the issue that with time and use, the frosting will slowly come off the board and not look that great. I'm personally not a big fan of polycarbonate as a case material for the longevity issues, as well as the durability issues, as well as the manufacturing and quality control issues of most polycarbonate. Now, there is one final issue, but we'll discuss that once we get into the case internals, and that has to do with the screws and the screw taps in the top case. Now, this particular unit came with black feet, and this may not annoy some people, but this annoys me quite a bit, considering this is a fully clear case and didn't come with clear feet. Now, I hunted around on the Geek Hack thread, and it seems that some polycarbonate buyers actually got clear feet, while others didn't, and had to buy them aftermarket. And these are a non-standard size. I believe 12 or 13 millimeter doesn't perfectly fit in here. And I believe you have to go up to 14 millimeter, which are a little bit harder to find in terms of bump-ons. Finally, we can take a look at the USB port, which sits perfectly on the seam and is pretty much 100% flush with the case exterior. I'm a big fan of this. I'm a big fan of USB-C in general. It's a nice, compact, durable connector, and having it sit flush on the outside of the case allows you to use bigger, bulkier, and wider and fancier connectors, and I'm a big fan of that. All right, let's open this thing up and hop into the interior and PCB and see what we're dealing with. All right. One of the first things we can tell is that when looking at the screws up close, we can see that quite a bit of their finishing has come off near the tip, and this can be indicative of a few things. This could be indicative of having not so clean screw taps in the top case. And we can tell this one here is a little bit black on the inside. Now, normally during the quality control process, as well as during the manufacturing process, the manufacturer will clean inside the screw taps. And it's very common, if you've ever QC'd or delivered a group buy, you'll know that these do need to be cleaned out once you receive them, as dirt and grime and all that stuff can get in there. Now with aluminum, that's not really an issue, since you can just thread a screw in there a couple of times, hit it with a little bit of canned air. But with a polycarbonate case, the issue is the screw taps themselves are made out of a rather soft plastic with quite a lot of give to them, and the screws you'll be using are metal. Now it is possible to use polycarbonate screws, but it doesn't necessarily remedy the situation. The situation being these screw taps will loosen up over time and will have issues keeping the board secure. Now you may have noticed during my disassembly that the screws at the back of the unit were not even screwed into the top case. Now this board, I believe, has only been disassembled a few times, and it's already gotten to the point where the top screw holes are already far too loose for the screws, which is very disappointing. Now, we'll take a look at the gasket mounting. Now, the gasket mounting is a very, very thin layer. Let's see if I can get it on camera. A very thin layer of adhesive here. And this is about as soft as a piece of plastic. It is not a very, like, in order to flex this, I'm actually flexing the case more than I am flexing the gasket. This is why I don't necessarily consider this a proper gasket mount. The way that it does mount is you've got adhesives here and here, as well as adhesives, similar adhesives on the top case. And what the PCB will do is actually just very, very comfortably nestle right in there. So under this there is rubber, and under this there is rubber, and then there is also rubber here, and when the case is fully tightened, that rubber will essentially hold the plate in place. Now if you did the math, you may have figured out that, okay, but I'm not even able to screw in my case fully because of the fact that it is a polycarbonate case with just standard polycarbonate screw taps. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the hardness of the gaskets is far too hard to be actually useful for any sort of gasketing realistically. This PCB has, this plate and PCB combo has almost no flex at all. Like right now, I'm literally bending the entire keyboard instead of just the plate, which is kind of counterintuitive for a gasket mount. So I'm not a big fan of that. What I am a big fan of is this internal engraving. Now I am a sucker for internal engraving. We can see here that the back weight, as seen before, is a wedge with a little leaf on it, and that mounts into the bottom case with simple 2 screws and sits flush with the rest of the case bottom. So there is no reason to realistically ever unscrew this. But it is incredibly well done, it is incredibly well machined, at least the aluminum is. The polycarbonate, I am not a huge fan of. Now, what we've got here is a aftermarket PCB. This is an aftermarket PCB that was designed to be used with the Duck Viper, as well as other compatible keyboards, of which this is one. Now, the original PCB that the owner of this board had was the hot swap. And if I remember correctly, when it arrived to him, it was completely bent out of shape. So he replaced it with this thing here. This is quite a nice PCB. I like the trace designs. It's actually got per switch RGB as well as underglow, and it looks like there's about 24 underglow LEDs. So it's quite wild. It's quite a lot of stuff that went in here, and we can tell that the connector can be put here instead of the center to allow for compatibility with a standard tray mount 60%, and then centered to allow for keyboards such as this one. Let's get these caps off. All right, now this plate here is a 1.5 millimeter fully clear piece of polycarbonate. I personally really like that. I really like this design, and it is quite unique in that it allows you to see the PCB. Now, in this particular build, there is foam put underneath the majority of the alphas. There's no foam here as to accommodate the spacebar stabilizer wire, though the original owner had issues with the sonic profile of this particular plate. Now, in general, there are various grades of polycarbonate, and this polycarbonate is incredibly rigid as compared to polycarbonates I am more comfortable with. I actually mistook this for an acrylic plate until I recently got in touch with Center and got a little bit of information about it. But this is polycarbonate. The plate cuts for acoustics are relatively nicely done, as are the cutouts for the switches. All the switches line up perfectly. None of the switches are massively crooked, and the stabilizer cutouts also look really good. The issue with polycarbonate such as this and thinner plastic plates, or thinner, more rigid plastic plates in general, is they have a more glassy sound. Now, this sounds a little deeper than it should because of the foam that's been put in between the plate and the PCB. Though traditionally, this glassy sound is fairly known. I mean, you can tap on a piece of acrylic. It is made as a replacement for glass, and this sounds a lot like acrylic. Now, the high pitch plate issue mostly is a problem with a full polycarbonate build, since a full polycarbonate will actually sound higher pitch than a full aluminum build. Generally, it is my opinion as a case in terms of case design. In terms of case design, I believe that if a designer has to put foam into his keyboard to get it to sound the way he wants it to, then the design has ultimately failed. Though in this case, the foam is aftermarket, and that was simply chosen by the original builder to help it get closer to the sound he was looking for. Other plate options were available. Now, with the polycarbonate, I would have suggested brass, and I would have suggested the brass weight to help first of all bring down the tone a little bit, make it a little bit deeper, and then throw in the brass weight to help dampen a little bit of the excess case vibrations. Though realistically, the difference between the aluminum weight and the brass weight is very minute. The design, however, is quite nicely done. Obviously, this is not the stock PCB, else I would have gone into a little bit more detail, though this is the stock plate. The edges are fairly sharp, but again, it is meant to sit perfectly in here and be gasketed / sandwiched by the top and bottom. Overall, I don't think that the case acoustics are an issue or the fault of the designer, since This very particular unit was produced in 3 different materials, and it's almost impossible to be able to first of all test everything, as well as push users to make the right decisions. For example, don't put the polycarbonate plate into this particular polycarbonate housing. One thing I may have liked to see would have been a softer polycarbonate here, in addition to the softer gaskets, because the simple fact that there is no flex here, like the whole keyboard actually moves when I do this, there is almost no flex, and that kind of negates the whole point of getting a thinner polycarbonate plate. Now, a lot of designers would be afraid that the switch pins would make contact with the metal area on the bottom, but there's actually a decent amount of gap here, and we can see that the PCB only comes up till about here, which gives us a little bit of room for flex. It would have been nice to have a little bit of flex, though. Again, that's just a little nitpicky thing, because realistically, I believe Sensor did open source the plate files, and if he didn't, I'm fairly certain you can reach out and get the plate files from him and be able to go with a little bit of a more flexible PCB. Though going with a more flexible PCB wouldn't necessarily fix the sound, they would just improve the typing feel a little bit. In terms of the typing feel, this feels closer to an aluminum keyboard than a full plastic keyboard. I don't think the keyboard takes full effect of its choice of materials. First of all, the gasket could have been substantially more gaskety or softer, or handled a little bit differently with a little bit less in terms of contact points, instead of contacting the entire bottom as well as the entire top. A more flexible plate would have been nice, though bottom clearance could have potentially been an issue, so that remains to be seen. And the issue where the threads for all of the case screws will eventually get messed up over time, that's not too great, because if your design is relying on the top and bottom piece being held together incredibly tight in order to gasket the plate, and that fails, then you're essentially definitely losing any benefits of whatever gasketing you had. Overall, though, I think that the Leaf 6G is a very nice keyboard. I'm just not a big fan of the polycarbonate variant. I think the aluminum variant, I listened to a few sound tests, it sounds pretty good. The brass variant sounds pretty good, and even the polycarbonate with different plate materials sounded pretty good. I'm just not a fan of all of the drawbacks of having a polycarbonate case. One quick thing is that there do exist little female threads that you can slip into the top piece, for example, and then have the screw into that. Though those also come with issues, since the metal piece is still contacting a polycarbonate piece, and then the polycarbonate piece can still wear out with time. Let's pop into a quick sound test and let you all hear what this sounds like in its current form. all in all, I rate this keyboard very, very well. I think the keyboard as a whole is great. This particular unit is probably not the best one on earth. I think in terms of the value proposition at, you know, just over $300 with fees and shipping, this is a very, very good value. Most of Center or Fox Labs keyboards tend to be very good value, and his quality control is good, his packaging is good, his unboxing experience is pretty good. If I had to rate this, I'd rate this maybe in, well, this particular keyboard, I'd rate like a 6 or a 7 out of 10 at best because of all the issues of polycarbonate, but the aluminum version of this would sit much higher at 8.5, maybe even a 9. I'm hesitant to give it anything higher than that because for this particular use case, this type of keyboard, so lightweight, 60%, there are quite a few options. You can always get an HHKB, they're super light. You can always just get a cheap plastic 60% and just do it yourself. Just a normal Taobao case, slap it together for maybe 100, 200 bucks. And then you don't have to worry about scratching it. You don't have to worry about it getting yellow and all of that. So overall, like, it's a spectacular little keyboard. It actually shocked me. The typing experience is quite good, though, you know, I personally prefer a softer, more flexier typing feel. This was surprisingly rigid for what it was. And overall, I like it. I like it a lot. And if you like the Simon, drop a like, maybe drop a sub. We're going to do more in-depth reviews. We're going to do some more keyboard tutorials. We're going to do all the good stuff. So I'll see you guys on the next one.